everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Securing Trust, Cybersecurity, and Compliance Automation for Health IT Vendors. Today, we have Michael Zagorski from Drummond. He's our Risk and Security Assessor, and Greta Witt from Drata. Both are going to go through some cybersecurity trends as well as some information about Drata's automation tool. For some housekeeping, this session is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be available after the webinar. And there will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to add your questions at any time using the webinar chat. Okay, Michael, are you ready to go ahead and start going through your slides?
I appreciate it. Perfect. So we've got a bit of an agenda here. Like Lucy just mentioned, we'll jump right into some of the healthcare regulations, talk a little bit about some of the rule sets that are impacting different organizations within healthcare in general. Specifically, I kind of want to tailor today's conversation to the vendor side. I know there's a lot of end practitioners or healthcare providers. However, a lot of these items that we're going to be discussing today will really be impacting the vendors, which ultimately does trickle down to the individual clients as well. So some of the specific regulations that we'll be mentioning today, we'll be talking about Title 21, Part 11. That kind of covers some of the FDA requirements. We're also going to be talking a lot about HIPAA and just general HIPAA in scope or business entities. And this is going to include the security piece, the privacy piece, as well as the breach notification piece. A lot of organizations tend to cover one or two of them, but not all three, and tend to just pick and choose. Realistically, all three are important. I did also want to provide an honorable mention to HITech and HITRUST. Again, we're talking about vendors here, so HITRUST is a very hot topic for organizations that are trying to work together, have kind of like a trust center, and be able to provide documentation to their customers to prove their level of compliance or their level of security that they can provide to their customers. And then we've also got some items to talk about as far as state-specific regulations are concerned. And then we've also got kind of a hot button topic with international standards. A lot of organizations and vendors tend to focus specifically on US-based if that's where they're operating. But if they wish to sell their software or provide services overseas, we see a lot in the UK, also some footholds in Australia as well. There are some additional requirements and regulations that they may need to adhere to. So something to consider when branching out into different geographic regions. With that, one of our first topics is going to be talking fourth party risk. Again, we're going to put our vendor hats back on to your organization. Your vendors are going to be, or your customers rather, you're going to be their third party provider to them. But as a vendor, your third parties are a fourth party to, the end users. This is really something that's a topic that mainly comes out of the manufacturing world. Supply chain risks isn't something that's as commonly talked about in the healthcare or in the IT space, but it's a critical factor to discuss when considering security of your customers' data. And, it starts with contracts being in place. That's really going to be the first step in the whole process. And you as an organization need to assess those risks. Obviously, you're going to have those contracts in place, those BAAs, but doing some sort of vendor risk assessments, looking for third-party certifications they can provide to you are going to be critical when looking for onboarding your own third parties and potentially even providing that down to your clients or customers. And it's also very important to understand where your data is held with which third parties and who has access to that data. So understanding that data governance piece and mapping out where all of your data is located is going to be very important, especially when working with multiple third parties. And just as a general call out, we're coming into the tail end of 2025 here, and we've been talking about trends that we've been seeing. And one of the things that we wanted to call out is some of the shifts that we've seen to hybrid cloud, as well as going back on premises, whether that be within your own data center or leveraging a co-location, renting equipment, or potentially even buying equipment again. Over the last 5 or so years, we've seen a massive rush to go out into the cloud, but some organizations are really finding benefits with hosting their own data, knowing that they have ownership. And there's been a lot of changes in the licensing space, specifically for software. Talking about vendor lock-in and who has access to that data PHI or any other potentially PII, other sensitive data is in there. I think it's an interesting change that we're seeing in the industry. With that, we can jump into some of the changing regulations. So we called out the high level regulations, but two things that I wanted to call out specifically for this webinar. We've been seeing several organizations that are working out of Maryland. They do have PHI from customers that do reside there. And there's been some recent shifts to some of their state regulations that have impacted a lot of different platforms. And realistically, the health information exchanges is what it's called, but the regulation is so broad that we're finding that it's impacting a lot of businesses, not just health information exchanges. Even EHRs are considered under the rule to be potentially a health information exchange, which has pushed new audit requirements, annual audit requirements to those companies. And there's some very specific rules and regulations that they have on top of the existing HIPAA rule set that organizations already need to adhere to. So we've been working with organizations trying to get them prepared, have some sort of an opinion letter that they can submit to the state of Maryland. But this has been a very common trend for some of the state specific requirements. We've seen some out of Washington, out of New York, and out of California, where those local changes have been impacting business and causing a little bit of headache. We've also seen some proposed rule changes to the HIPAA security rule. However, we have yet to see this go into final rule. They had a period for comments, and that closed earlier this year. And I think organizations and key stakeholders in the industry had a lot of feedback. The whole NPRM group and everybody within HHS needed to take some time to readjust any of those changes to make sure that it doesn't have such a big impact on those smaller businesses. One key item that I want to call out is penetration testing became a requirement under this proposed rule. Now, we may see that with larger organizations that are doing it annually or potentially multiple times a year, but some of those smaller businesses and individual practitioners, that's not something that they're necessarily doing. It's more of an ad hoc thing, or if there's a specific checkbox rule that they need to tick off for compliance purposes, that's going to be their only driving factor. Otherwise, they're not so much concerned with security. So we're seeing a lot of big impacts. Obviously, that's not final rule quite yet, but more to come. It's a good idea. If you're not already registered for our newsletter, you can go under the resources tab on our website, sign up for that newsletter. And if any new changes do come through, generally we try to include those within our newsletters as kind of a heads up. So make sure to check that out if you aren't already registered. Going back to some of the geographic growth, geographic risk, again, as organizations, everybody wants to grow. They want more foothold in the market, want to be able to have more offerings. You may have flagship products, but you want to add in the specific items that niche parts of the industry need. It's just very important to take that within consideration when adding some of these features, because you might be subject to new rules or regulations. We talk about HIPAA a lot just because it's so broad, but we have ONC, EPCS, all these specific testing items that are kind of adjacent to general healthcare, but have very specific tranches within them. The compliance that comes behind it, the documentation, making sure that you have all your controls in place, it's something that needs to come with that process as well. And obviously that comes with non-compliance fees, potential sanctions to your organization that can end up, putting a red mark next to your name in the industry if you're not following all the standards. So potential for lost customers, reputational damage, and business interruptions are critical things to consider when branching out into some of these new regulations. And we did mention ONC. ONC, we do have a lot of customers potentially on this call that do cover ONC. They've already gone through their certification and testing. And it's important to admit that there is a lot of shared controls within that, but it's not going to cover the entirety of HIPAA. There are very specific rules for HIPAA. ONC is a great place to start. However, it's important to go through and double check all of your HIPAA related controls, both on the privacy piece, breach notification piece, and then also on the security rule, making sure that your organization is covered from all angles. And it's important to note that this should also be business as usual, right? Making sure you're building in these checks to your business to happen on an ongoing basis. You need to make sure as an organization that just because you have something in place right now doesn't mean that 6 months from now, your organization isn't going to make some changes, potentially change vendors, change something within your application. And one of those specific requirements may fall out of place. So ongoing monitoring, doing constant testing essentially to make sure that your controls are in place are going to be critical. And this is something that we provide, if you need a third party with like an expert to come in with a specific regulation or need assistance with that, we're always happy to help. And my last hot button topic, I know everybody's tired of hearing about AI, but it's still a topic that we need to discuss. A lot of organizations, especially smaller or younger organizations, are starting to gain access to tooling to allow them to incorporate AI into their platforms or even some of their tooling. It's getting easier and easier day by day to integrate some of these tools. But organizations don't really know how to address some of those items. So what are regulators expecting? Again, the same thing, business as usual. The same way that you're hosting any application today also applies to AI, limiting any sort of sharing of potentially sensitive data, including with third parties. If you do have third parties, your BAAs, your contract language, making sure that they're going to secure and maintain control over that environment. And then following the same standards and hardening procedures that you have for your general applications, just make sure that they apply to your AI applications as well. And I want to call out some approaches that we've seen over the last few months to kind of work around some of those items. Leveraging a third party and, API keys where you're just sending potentially PHI to that third party. It's easy. It's a great way to get started, but it's not secure and it violates some of the rules as far as information sharing go. Some of the things that we've seen is a lot of locally hosted LLMs. And in one specific case, we even had a client where they had individual practitioners that were using a VDI system, and they actually had rented GPUs as a part of that VDI infrastructure. And that allowed them to run the LLMs locally. So they had an application to help them to fill out notes, and they were able to use that LLM, potentially punch in information or get feedback on symptoms, things like that, through those LLMs without sharing any data with a third party. That's all being hosted locally. Those LLMs are downloaded locally. And ultimately, they had full control over the storage of those devices and making sure that that's all encrypted. And at the end of the session, if you wish to terminate it, you can go ahead and wipe that. And next time you go to use that system, you can just spin up a golden image and don't have to worry about any latent PHI residing on those systems. So again, the same way that you're going to be hosting your regular applications that may handle PHI, if you're going to incorporate any sort of AI, treat any sort of AI the same way that you would a standard application. That's the best advice that we can give you. And talking more to some of the vendor piece, ensuring trust with any of your clients, some of these standards and certifications are very important, specifically SOC 2, ISO 27001, and a lot of the NIST standards. Those are going to be the most popular that we're seeing. A lot of organizations are mapping out their internal controls to these standards. That's their base set of controls. We want to harden to these standards and follow those best practices. Internal control testing is the best way to make sure that everything's in check. You have these other healthcare regulations. It's very easy to map those back to these base set standards. So if your organization already follows ISO 27001, a lot of the controls within HIPAA or high tech, they map back directly to an existing control within ISO. So that's a great way to kind of start off. And as you add new regulations to your portfolio, just continue to map them back to existing controls within your organization. Also, gap assessments are going to be critical. This goes back to that ongoing monitoring. So go back in, make sure if you're deficient in any of those control areas, you can address those. Having a gap isn't necessarily a bad thing. Having a gap and not identifying, that's bad news. So as long as you're identifying gaps and places that you have room for improvement as an organization, allows you to do continual improvement and identify and remediate those weaknesses. And then you always have the option for having a third party, right? You can have a third party come in, do an independent assessment and provide you your open items or gaps and have you address them. That also allows a little bit of separation of duties from people who work on systems versus people who don't have a conflict of interest. So that's always an option for your organization. They're very common and very well read in on a lot of the standards. So you don't have to try to decipher some of the language in each one of these regulations. You can just work with somebody who's an expert in the field, provide some time savings to your organization as well. And that also goes back into some of the business benefits, talking about trust for your customers. If you can provide some sort of a SOC 2 report or evidence, an executive summary of a NIST CSF or an 853 to say, hey, look, we went through this process. We mapped these controls back to our standards. We've made sure that we have all of these items in place. Or maybe, hey, we found a potential deficiency here. We identified it, though we're working on getting better. That allows for some additional trust between you and your customers and helps create that relationship. And it's also value to, your customers as well, right? You're working on implementing those controls so they don't have to, right? They're paying you to go through all of those efforts. So they just have a one-click experience and they can use your platform or solution to do their business while you work on the solution itself. Now, with that, I'd like to introduce Gretel again from Drata. I know she has some slides that she wants to cover. Talk to us a little bit about automation. I'll let you take it away, Gretel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gretel Witt. I'm a senior GRC analyst at Drata. I support a variety of work streams across our compliance program, including our annual audit certifications. I support our vendor security reviews. I help support our customer questionnaires. And I'm excited to share my perspective on how to scale compliance through automation today. Michael, you highlighted something really important, and I think that is the fact that a lot of customers or a lot of clients are facing a very complex compliance landscape today. There's a lot of frameworks and oftentimes a lot of overlapping requirements that companies are having to navigate, which is a really great segue into the question I want to help answer today, which is how can compliance automation like Drata help us keep all of these requirements in check and without overburdening our teams and slowing the business down? To talk about this, we sort of have to understand how Drata does things differently. So I want to say the majority of the market probably has a very manual approach to compliance. And what I mean by that is when a customer asks you to be compliant with SOC 2 or HIPAA, the first thing companies have to do is figure out what that even means for them. Someone has to go and do some research on the framework, pull down the requirements. Maybe you have your auditors help you with that, and then figure out what controls you need to have in place to meet those requirements. From there, those controls usually end up being tracked in spreadsheets and are manually mapped to requirements. And every time something changes, a new control, a new owner, a new framework, somebody has to go in there and update those spreadsheets by hand. Evidence collection is not much better. Most of the time, teams are taking screenshots, saving them to Google Drive folders, for example, messaging or emailing them to the right person or team, and tracking evidence collection progress via spreadsheets. And you kind of just hope you didn't miss anything when it's time for the audit. And what's the result of all this manual work? Compliance kind of starts to feel like a burden and something that slows your growth instead of enabling you. Why does compliance end up feeling this way? It just comes down to the limits of this traditional and manual approach, right? Firstly, it's very reactive. Most teams only focus on compliance when an audit is around the corner. So that means last minute scrambles. Second, evidence is scattered everywhere. You've got your HR data in one system, cloud configs in another, tickets in Jira, policies in your Google Drive maybe. Nothing is centralized, and that makes it really hard to track and stay organized. Third, it's very manual. Screenshots and spreadsheets, like I mentioned before, checklists, all of those are used to drive the process, which makes it really painful. And then lastly, it doesn't scale. What works for small startups completely breaks when you have hundreds of employees or multiple frameworks or dozens of systems to manage. And that's kind of the reality of traditional compliance, is it is viewed as more of a burden instead of the enabler. So what's the alternative? That's where compliance automation really comes in to change the game. So instead of being a reactive scramble once a year, automation helps make it a continuous process. So continuous monitoring helps you know where you stand at all times, where your compliance program stands at all times. Instead of evidence being scattered across dozens of tools, automation helps pull everything into one centralized system. So no need to go to Workday or AWS to capture all of these evidence. It's being pulled into one system. And instead of spending hours on manual screenshots and updating spreadsheets, evidence is collected automatically through integrations with the systems that you already use. And the result is compliance is no longer this burden, but it's actually helping your business to grow. Drata takes everything we just talked about, all these requirements, all these controls and evidence, and puts them into one place. So what they've done is they've already done all this research on the frameworks and regulations for you, and they've translated those requirements into best practices by building a pre-built controls framework that are already mapped to the regulations you care about. So if you care about SOC 2 and HIPAA, they have these controls pre-built for you. Drata connects to your systems, your cloud providers, your HR platform, identity providers, ticketing tools, and continuously monitors them. Every time it sees a control in place, it will automatically collect and store that evidence for you. If a control is not in place, it'll also flag that and let you know so that you can go in and fix those issues before they become audit findings. And because everything is centralized, you can use that real-time data to streamline your audits, manage risks, and also share your security posture with customers through a trust center. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about how Drata works, let's take a look at what this platform actually looks like. So this is a screenshot of the compliance dashboard. Right at the top, you'll see your audit readiness across multiple frameworks at once. So whichever frameworks you have in scope, you can essentially pin to the top here and see where you stand. So in this example, you see maybe PSI, you've got 38 out of however many controls, or 57 out of 205 controls for NIST, for example. You can kind of see where you stand. Below that, you get some visibility into trends, like which tests are failing, your policy status, some vendor risk stats. You can spot some of these issues before they turn into findings. And over to the right, you've got some tasks and notifications with due dates so your team knows what to be focusing on or what you need to be working on next. And the whole point here is that you have one place to go to understand the health of your compliance program in real time without having to dig through spreadsheets or waiting until audit season to find out what's broken. So this is one of my favorite parts of Drata, the frameworks view. Each card here represents a framework, and what's really powerful is that you can instantly see how far along you already are, even for frameworks you haven't officially pursued yet. So for example, maybe you're SOC 2 compliant today, but you've been thinking about ISO 27001 or HIPAA. Drata shows you that you're already, say, 60 or 70% of the way there because many of the controls overlap across these frameworks. And traditionally, each framework meant starting over. You would have to duplicate evidence, run new checklists, repeat the same manual work in different formats. This visibility makes it really easy to build a roadmap for future certifications since you know exactly what's left to do. For example, if you want to pursue DORA or FedRAMP, you can see you're 56% of the way there already, and you can kind of plan out how you want to achieve FedRAMP and what work is left for you to do to achieve FedRAMP. This is another really useful feature about Drata is the continuous monitoring. So I think this is where the magic really happens. Instead of waiting till audit season to find out that you had a control that was failing, Drata is running these tests every single day across all of your connected systems. So at the top, you can see kind of your status, what percentage of tests are passing, how many tests are failing. This makes it easy to prioritize what needs attention. For example, you can see in this example, security awareness training hasn't been completed by X amount of employees, or MFA is disabled and needs to go and be re-enabled. This is really just helpful to address these findings before an audit comes through, and it flags them for you and surfaces them for you as opposed to finding out later or being surprised later. Another useful feature is the policy center. So we kind of looked at how Drata continuously monitors controls and alerts when something's out of compliance, but controls are not the whole story. You need strong, well-documented policies that are reviewed and acknowledged on a regular basis, and that's where Drata's policy center comes in. Traditionally, companies manage policies through emails or PDFs or shared drives, and then try to track approvals in a spreadsheet, and it can get messy really fast. With Drata, all of your policies live in one place, so employees can log in, review, acknowledge them directly, and you can track completion in real time. And then right at the top there, you get a snapshot of your entire policy program. So how many are coming up for renewal? Which ones are past due? Which ones still need approval before they can be published? And below that, you can drill into each individual policy to see the owner, version history, approved date, next renewal date. You can also push employee notifications if you make a policy update, for example, and you need them to re-acknowledge. So it's really easy to see who hasn't yet acknowledged the policies and follow up with them if needed. In addition to policies and controls, you also need to have a way to manage your vendor risk, right? So every company relies on dozens, sometimes hundreds of third-party tools and services, and each of those represents a potential risk if they're not properly vetted. Drata's vendor module helps you organize all of that into one place. So here you can see a full list of vendors, risk tier, when they were last reviewed. You can upload your vendor reports and certifications here, track those renewals, and document your security reviews all in this module. This makes it really easy when it comes audit season and your auditors are asking you to show some evidence of vendor reviews or that you're doing your due diligence. You can pull up your evidence right here. All right. Can't forget about our SafeBase Trust Center. So, as some of you may know, Drata acquired SafeBase earlier this year, and it's been really exciting. The SafeBase Trust Center acts as a portal where customers can see exactly what they need to evaluate your security posture. So, instead of sending PDFs back and forth when customers ask you to provide a summary of your last pen test or your most recent SOC 2 report, customers can self-serve this information directly from your SafeBase Trust Center. So, you decide what to make public and what to gate behind an NDA, and your customers can then come and access those documents from your trust center. And I think the impact is huge here. It helps your security and GRC teams spend less time on the back and forth, and sales teams are able to close deals a lot faster without having to deal with those bottlenecks. This really showcases the shift from compliance being something you have to do to something that is actively supporting your business growth. Next slide, please. And then I don't want to forget about this awesome feature of SafeBase. My team uses this every single day. It's one of the biggest time sinks for security and GRC teams are customer questionnaires. Sometimes you get questionnaires that are 100 or 200 or 300 plus questions, and those are very time consuming. SafeBase uses AI to auto-complete questionnaires using your Trust Center information and past responses, so you spend less time copying and pasting those answers and instead you can focus your attention on reviewing and approving answers instead. The time savings for my team has been huge. What used to take us maybe a day, half a day to a full day to complete now takes us maybe 1 or 2 hours at most. So really love this. It's called SafeBase AI Questionnaire Assistance, and it's awesome. You can upload your questionnaires in here. It does support some portal questionnaires as well. So far, it's been an awesome, awesome feature. So future of compliance automation, I want to leave you with where compliance is kind of heading. We've talked about manual compliance. We talked about how you can automate your compliance. And now the compliance automation space is entering kind of a new area, and that is the use of agentic AI. So instead of running static automation that just runs the same checklist every time, we're moving toward intelligent autonomous workflows that actually will take action for you. One example that Drata recently unveiled is our new VRM agent that automatically collects vendor evidence and evaluates that risk in real time for you. So instead of you having to go do all this data chasing and saying like, hey, can you please provide your SOC 2 report? This agent will actually go and do that for you, and it will review that report for you and surface any findings that it may have or any risks that it found. And then you from there can be the decision maker on how you want to proceed. Really exciting stuff. I think that's the future of compliance. I think there's a lot more automation that's on the horizon, and yeah, super exciting. So with that, I'll hand it back for any questions.
Thanks, Gretel. That was awesome. I do see that we have a bunch of questions in the chat. I think we should just start to field some of them. Let's see. What steps can providers take to make sure vendors are meeting HIPAA requirements? So that's a loaded question, right? We see the first step is generally going to be a BAA, right? You want to have that agreement in place, your contract language. But we did just see SafeBase, right? So you have cases where third-party assessments are being conducted, maybe not so specifically to some of those healthcare regulations, but they encompass a broader area. So that's a great way to kind of ensure that whatever organization you're going to get into contact with, or you're going to sign a contract, are providing their due diligence steps and making sure that they're following the regulations that they need to. What do you see as the biggest cybersecurity threat to EHR systems today, and how should healthcare organizations prepare for it? We were actually chatting about this the other day, and we made the analogy, instead of putting all of your eggs in one basket, sometimes organizations put all of their eggs in somebody else's basket. So when you have a third party, sometimes you are at their mercy on how they are going to safeguard that data and make sure that you have availability to that data. Contract language is going to be the biggest thing, but also having your own backups and break glass ways to handle that data is also critical, right? We like to talk about business continuity planning, and I think that that's a massive piece. If you're relying on a third party, you need to have additional ways to access your data and make sure that you have your own data backed up as well, or work with the third party on how that's going to be addressed. Several ways to take care of it. Contract language may not be the only way to go nowadays.
If I can also add to that, Mike, with respect to EHRs, I've been speaking with a lot of our EHR customers more recently. I'm not going to call anybody out as specifically complacent. However, I think, there's a view that, well, we can do pen testing. every other year, or we can revalidate our HIPAA or a risk assessment at an organizational every other year, and they try to prioritize that way. And I think at least 3 times this year, we've had pen testing projects where we've been working with a vendor that literally the day we start, we end up having an urgent phone call because of the type of vulnerability that we find is so latent and significant. We had one customer just yesterday that became an urgent matter. So I think doing those things regularly is really important.
And on an ongoing basis. I think we talked about a little
Yes.
bit. Regular basis. Are regulators likely to require more transparency into vendor supply chains? Short answer, yes. And we'd like to see more of it. Quick shout out to PCI as well. We're starting to see specific requirements being built out into standards and requirements that say, hey, you need to support your customers' requirements for them to meet the standards. So that kind of trickle down process, we're starting to see a little bit more of that. We're hoping to see more of it in the healthcare space. Specifically with HIPAA, we're finding it's really tough to prove HIPAA adherence or conformity to HIPAA. The best thing that we've seen is opinion letters or evidence that an assessment was done internally. So that's a great starting point for that.
I think evidence of that as well are those BAAs, right? It's your responsibility to ensure you have those BAAs in place. And I think the proliferation of that as well is what makes something like SafeBase make sense, right? You have a significant amount of that where you are being held responsible for your vendors. And there are plenty of times where large organizations are exploited because of a much smaller vendor that has that access to them. I think there was a large retailer about 20 years ago that had a pretty significant hack, and it all came down to their HVAC system, their HVAC, a vendor that installed something and it had a weak password.
What is the cadence for vendors to undergo security reviews or audits? Generally, we see annually, but that's going to kind of depend on the risk of the vendor. If you have a higher risk vendor that you're sharing a lot of data with, not so much that you think that they're a risky organization to be working with, but more so you have a lot of business critical data that you're sharing with them, maybe worthwhile to re-review those more frequently on a quarterly basis. Your larger vendors, things like that. Smaller vendors that have less of an impact can probably be done on an annual basis, but also identifying which ones are your critical vendors and not so critical vendors, and having them on a sliding scale also may be helpful to go through that process.
I think also certain frameworks you do annually, but the reality is we talk with a lot of customers who say, okay, well, we're going to do our HIPAA in the first quarter, and then we have PCI every year in the second quarter, and our ISO in the third quarter, and SOC 2 in the fourth quarter. And there's a cadence that you get into with those various requirements. So while you may be doing each one of them annually, you're constantly going through. And I always make the analogy that it's one big ring of intersecting Venn diagrams, which again ties in very nicely with Drata, where you have a lot of controls that do overlap as well. So I think it's an ongoing initiative.
100%. What are some common red flags in vendor security assessments? Red flags, I would say the first thing is not having a willingness to be open, right? If you're a vendor and you're being very cagey with your information, oh, this is too sensitive. Oh, we have that covered, but they won't tell you what's going on internally. I think that that's kind of a red flag to me. Gretel, I'll tap you on the shoulder here. Do you have any red flags that you can think of or anything that you've seen?
Oh man, I'd have to put my auditor hat on.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you covered some of them there. The auditors that you're looking at, there's some auditor bias out there too. I think these days,
That's
people
true.
can think they can just rely on certain auditors if you see the name and they're like, oh, I'm just not going to review this vendor report.
Interesting.
It really requires a good, thorough review.
So almost like complacency.
Yeah.
Having seen all that you have demonstrated so far, Drata appears to be similar to other GRC tools available. How is Drata different from other GRC tools like Aramba? Gretel?
Yeah, great question. To be honest, I'm not too familiar with Aramba. I was just doing a little research on it right now to see what Aramba offers. I probably couldn't tell you fully what the difference is between Drata and Aramba, but I can say Drata offers a lot of automation and intelligence capabilities out of the box, essentially. So you don't have to build those yourself. but they're built in these integrations. You just need to hook them up. You don't actually have to own those integrations yourselves. And so I think that helps save some time in the long run. Is Drata provides these features for you and these integrations for you out of the box. Great question.
Perfect.
Well, thank you for everybody for participating, and thank you to Gretel and Michael for taking the time. I apologize I wasn't on at the beginning of the call. My computer froze, so I wasn't able to join. Certainly feel free to follow up with us at Drummond Group. We're happy to put you in touch with Drata. Certainly, if you have any additional questions, we are also going to have an AMA for HIPAA in about a month, so please feel free to join that as well. Thank you.